My name is Jenna Porter, and I never expected a family camping trip to turn into the moment everything snapped. We were gathered around the grill beside the RV, smoke curling into the evening air, when my grandpa suddenly raised his voice like he was making a proud announcement. Your car loan's fully paid now. $12,000 is no joke, but you deserve something nice. The table went silent. Forks stilled midair. Someone stopped the music, and I just stood there, staring at him, because none of it made sense. I blinked once. Grandpa, I don't even have a car. That was when the hush turned heavier, almost rehearsed. Every face shifted away from mine. Every glance carried guilt or fear, just not surprise. Before I could press anyone, my sister walked up the gravel path holding a brand new set of keys, swinging them like a prize she'd earned. She didn't look at me. She didn't have to. I didn't say a word. I didn't accuse anyone. I simply felt something sharp settle inside me. Quiet, steady, undeniable. 2 hours later, while everyone else laughed near the fire pit like nothing had happened, I opened my loan app. A fresh approval. $12,000. My name. And just when I thought the night couldn't get worse, my grandpa slipped a thick folder across the picnic table, refusing to meet my eyes. At 2 in the morning, my phone lit up with messages. And that was the moment I realized they weren't afraid of what they'd done. They were afraid of what I might do next. Before I tell you what happened after that, and how everything spiraled faster than anyone expected, make sure you follow the channel so you don't miss the rest of this story. There was a moment later that night when the noise of the campground faded just enough for my thoughts to settle into something sharper. The laughter drifting from the fire pit no longer sounded familiar. It felt like a language I had stopped understanding. I stayed near the RV, letting the dim porch light hold me in its small circle, steady enough to keep my hands still while everything inside me shifted. My phone screen glowed in the dark as I opened the loan app again. The numbers didn't change. My name stood above a balance I never asked for, arranged neatly like someone had been confident I wouldn't question it. The quiet that followed wasn't fear. It was clarity. It was the realization that all the small compromises I had made over the years had added up into something much larger than one stolen loan. Scrolling through old statements felt like peeling back layers of a story I didn't know I was part of. A utility bill doubled without explanation, a membership fee that kept renewing even after I thought I canceled it. A charge for a service none of us used anymore. They weren't mistakes. They were breadcrumbs in a trail I hadn't noticed because I kept trying to be reasonable, patient, accommodating. Somewhere along the way, being helpful had turned into being convenient, and convenience had turned into entitlement. The pattern arranged itself with a kind of cruel consistency. Every time I stepped in to solve a small problem, another one appeared. Every time I gave someone the benefit of the doubt, they took another inch. They must have assumed the inches didn't matter. They must have believed I'd keep absorbing the weight so they could stay comfortable. The loan wasn't a beginning. It was the point they stopped pretending they needed permission. The longer I stared at the numbers, the more something inside me untangled. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was awareness. A clean, cold understanding that people rarely change when they realize they've gone too far. They change when the person they're taking advantage of stops letting them. I closed the app and opened my credit report instead. I expected a few surprises, but the list went deeper than I imagined. Small inquiries, old addresses I didn't recognize, accounts marked as shared, though I never agreed to share anything. None of it catastrophic on its own, yet together they formed a picture only one explanation fit. They had been using my information long before tonight, not because they needed to, but because it was easy. For a moment, I tried to trace the exact point when ease became expectation. Maybe it was the year I covered a bill while someone was between jobs. Maybe it was the month I helped with a minor emergency, thinking it was a one-time thing. Maybe it was the day I started believing that staying quiet kept peace. Each memory pressed against the next one, forming a timeline built entirely on small permissions I never meant to give. The campground lights flickered as families settled into their RVs for the night. I stayed where I was, letting the air cool around me. I didn't need explanations or apologies. What I needed was control over my accounts, my name, my boundaries. I opened the settings on every financial app I had and began the slow, methodical process of taking back what I should never have lost. Changing passwords felt like reclaiming pieces of myself. Freezing my credit felt like locking a door that had been left open too long. Removing shared devices and subscriptions tightened the space around me in a way that felt stable for the first time in years. None of these actions were dramatic. None of them required confrontation. They were simple corrections to a balance that had been off-center far too long. The messages started coming before I even finished. A notification from a shared service asking for reauthorization, another from a device trying to reconnect, then a third from an account that had lost access completely. Each alert confirmed the same truth. They had been reaching into parts of my life they should never have touched. A familiar tension rose in my chest, but it wasn't panic. It was resolve. The kind that forms when pretending nothing is wrong becomes impossible. The kind that grows when a line finally stops moving. I set my phone down and breathed in the quiet. The night no longer felt heavy. It felt accurate, honest. The truth was simple. They had crossed a boundary I didn't know was still open, and now it was closed. Every notification that followed was only proof of how used to access they'd become, access they no longer had. There was something unsettling about how the campground quieted the later it got, as if the darkness encouraged truths to surface one layer at a time. I sat at the small table inside the RV, the overhead light humming faintly above me while the folder my grandpa had handed over rested in front of me. I hadn't opened it earlier because I already knew whatever waited inside would confirm what I'd begun to understand. Still, my hands hovered over the edge longer than I expected, steady but weighted with the awareness that once I looked, I couldn't unsee any of it. When I finally lifted the cover, the papers inside were arranged with a precision that made everything feel deliberate. The first page carried my name in bold letters, printed neatly above a contract I had never signed. The organization of the paperwork suggested someone confident in their ability to replicate official structure. A finance agreement, insurance forms, a payment schedule. Each document matched the loan I found on my account, lined up like a timeline someone had crafted on my behalf without my knowledge. Then came the signature. Whoever copied it hadn't bothered perfecting it. It was my handwriting, technically, but only in the way a traced outline resembles the original drawing. A familiar curve here, an angle there, enough for a quick glance to justify it. The more I studied it, the more it felt like looking at a version of myself that someone else constructed. A version convenient to them. A version that didn't get a choice. Beneath those papers were copies of older documents, ones I did recognize. Forms from years ago, back when I'd agreed to be helpful during a busy season. My signature from that time had been lifted cleanly and placed beside agreements I'd never seen. The realization didn't land all at once. It spread slowly, forming a pattern that repeated itself with a confidence only built from practice. They didn't slip once. They didn't hesitate. They believed I wouldn't check. A quiet certainty settled in my chest. This folder wasn't meant for me out of guilt. It was meant for me because something had shifted in a way they couldn't dismiss. They sensed it, maybe before I did. My grandpa's expression earlier now made sense. It wasn't pride or excitement. It was resignation. A warning wrapped in silence. I continued through the stack, each page stitching together a picture of planning that hadn't happened overnight. A contact number from the dealership listed under an alternate email I'd never created. An insurance policy naming me as the primary, even though the vehicle clearly wasn't mine. A printed receipt showing the date the paperwork had been finalized, timed perfectly during a week when I'd been working late shifts, unreachable and distracted. It was efficient, strategic. They had chosen the exact moment when questioning anything would seem unreasonable. Toward the bottom of the folder sat a single sheet that didn't belong with the rest. A handwritten list, short but telling. Notes about timing. Notes about the dealership. Notes about what needed to be completed before the car could be released. It wasn't detailed enough to identify who wrote it, yet the tone was unmistakable. Someone mapping out the steps with confidence that none of it would ever surface. The deeper I went, the clearer it became that this wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. It wasn't something done under pressure or urgency. It was a process, careful, organized, and executed with the assumption that I would never look closely enough to catch any of it. My thoughts shifted to the faces around the fire earlier that night. The forced laughter. The way no one reacted when I said I didn't have a car. The immediate silence that followed. They hadn't been confused. They had been exposed. And exposure makes people freeze. As I gathered the papers into a single stack, the weight of them felt different than when I first opened the folder. These weren't just documents. They were proof of a boundary crossed long before today. They were evidence of a pattern I had unknowingly lived within, one shaped by convenience and dependency dressed as family obligation. I didn't feel angry. Anger implied surprise. What I felt was recognition, a recognition that what had been done wasn't accidental or circumstantial. It was intentional, consistent, calculated, and now undeniable. I closed the folder and placed it beside me, the decision forming before I even acknowledged it fully. Whatever came next wouldn't be emotional. It wouldn't be reactive. It would simply be necessary. The next morning arrived without ceremony, as if the night hadn't shifted anything at all. Families wandered across the campground carrying coolers and foldable chairs, unaware that a different kind of preparation had taken over my thoughts. I stepped out of the RV with a calm that didn't feel like resignation. It felt like alignment. Nothing around me needed to be loud anymore. Clarity didn't require volume. I moved through each action with a precision that surprised even me. It wasn't plotted or dramatic. It was simply a correction of the balance that had been tilted for too long. The first thing I did was open the security settings for every account attached to my life. Banking, cloud storage, email, subscriptions. The list was long enough to remind me how much convenience I had extended over the years without thinking twice. That generosity had turned into access, and access had been mistaken for permission. Changing passwords felt methodical rather than emotional. Each update closed a door that had been left open out of habit. Each confirmation screen replaced a space where my name had been used without my knowledge. I didn't rush through any of it. There was something grounding in the process, like tightening bolts on a structure that had remained shaky for too long. Once the essentials were secured, I went to the credit section again. Freezing the report was straightforward, a simple action that carried a quiet finality. The moment the notice confirmed the freeze, a subtle shift occurred inside me, like the click of a lock sliding into place. No one would be able to attach my identity to anything without me knowing. Not a loan, not an inquiry, nothing. Notifications began appearing almost immediately. A subscription asking to reconnect, a shared service reporting a missing profile, a device request denied due to new restrictions. The alerts popped up in uneven intervals, each one signaling how accustomed others had become to reaching into my accounts, as if they were part of their daily routine. Their surprise didn't concern me anymore. What mattered was that the routine had ended. I removed every connected device that wasn't mine. The list was longer than I expected. Screens I didn't own, locations I hadn't visited, sessions that were still active from months ago. The digital version of myself had been stretched thin without my awareness, scattered across platforms and logins I barely recognized. Clearing them out created a stillness in my chest, an internal space that felt newly reclaimed. As I worked, a question kept forming, not in confusion, but in recognition. How long had they relied on my inaction to keep this structure intact? It wasn't just about the loan. It was about the quiet assumption that I would tolerate what made their lives easier. Removing those assumptions one by one didn't feel like revenge. It felt like repositioning myself back into my own boundaries. More alerts came in. Access denied. Password expired. Profile removed. Each notification reflected a limit they hadn't encountered before. They could no longer log into accounts they thought were guaranteed. They could no longer use my services as a silent fallback. A sense of disorientation was likely spreading through the campground circle where they still gathered, but none of that reached me directly. I kept my focus narrow, precise. I checked my banking history one more time to ensure nothing else had slipped through unnoticed. Charges that once blended into the background now appeared with a different meaning. Transactions I had brushed off as forgettable suddenly held outlines of intent. I flagged everything questionable, not out of anger but out of necessity. Protecting myself wasn't overreaction, it was overdue. Disconnecting the shared hotspot brought another wave of notifications. That service had been used regularly, often without acknowledgement. Shutting it down felt symbolic, though symbolism wasn't my aim. It was just another step in consolidating what was mine. The campground noise shifted slightly, the kind of murmur that suggested people were noticing something. I didn't need to look to know the exact source. Someone had probably tried logging into a service and found themselves locked out. Someone else likely questioned whether a glitch was happening. Confusion has a particular stillness before it turns into concern, and concern has an edge long before it becomes confrontation. I remained seated at the small RV table as the notifications continued. Every alert confirmed a truth I was no longer interested in cushioning. They had been living inside my generosity without considering its limits. Taking that space back wasn't dramatic. It was necessary. The folder from the night before sat beside me again, unchanged yet significant in a new context. It wasn't evidence of what they'd done. It was evidence of why I no longer needed to justify taking action. I didn't owe explanations for restoring what should have been mine all along. By the time the last notification quieted, my accounts reflected only my presence. No shared access, no hidden connections, no lingering traces of someone else's decisions. What remained was a version of my life that belonged entirely to me, uncompromised, unborrowed, and unmistakably closed to anyone who had treated it as a convenience. Everything was finally aligned the way it should have been from the beginning. There was a particular calm that settled over me once every account had been secured, a stillness that didn't suggest completion, but readiness. The campground remained in its usual rhythm, children running between gravel paths, the faint smell of breakfast lingering in the air, conversations rising and falling beyond the RV walls. None of it reached me in a meaningful way. My focus narrowed to the kind of clarity that forms only after the first barriers have been reinforced. I knew what needed to happen next, and I no longer felt conflicted about taking that step. The folder sat beside me again, not as a source of shock, but as a reference point. Everything inside it pointed to a single conclusion. Someone had treated my identity as a resource with no limits. That understanding didn't leave me angry. It left me resolute. Correcting a mistake required patience. Correcting a pattern required precision. I opened my laptop and pulled up the dealership's information. The process of reporting identity misuse wasn't complicated. It simply required details and documentation. I supplied both without hesitation. Each field I completed created a widening distance between what had been done and what would no longer be tolerated. When the confirmation finally appeared on the screen, the feeling wasn't satisfaction. It was alignment. The record now reflected the truth. not the version constructed for convenience. Once the report was filed, I reviewed the policy notes outlining the next steps: ownership, liability, recovery. The terms were impersonal but firm, and the clarity of procedure worked in my favor. The dealership had protocols for situations like this, and those protocols were already moving forward. Whatever arrangements had been made using my name were no longer secure. That realization wasn't a threat. It was an adjustment returning things to where they belonged. After closing the laptop, I turned to my financial tools again. Reporting the misuse to the appropriate agencies required accuracy, not emotion. I submitted the necessary forms, attaching copies from the folder as verification. Each upload, each confirmation message created a structure of accountability that didn't depend on anyone's opinion. It depended on facts. Facts that had been ignored until now. When I finished, a notification appeared from my email. At first, I assumed it was an automated acknowledgement. Instead, it came from a monitoring service flagging suspicious activity tied to my information. The recommendation included steps for additional protection, all of which I completed. There was nothing surprising in the alert. It simply underscored how long this access had gone unchecked and how familiar they had become with crossing boundaries that weren't theirs. The next alert was different. It came from a federal agency, one responsible for overseeing financial discrepancies. They acknowledged the report and noted that irregularities associated with my identity had been detected previously. The message outlined a preliminary review, neither accusatory nor urgent, simply procedural. The neutrality of the language didn't soften the reality. Someone had used my information in ways that triggered attention, long before I realized anything had been done. The weight of that knowledge didn't unsettle me. It grounded me. Every assumption I had made about minor oversights or accidental charges now reshaped into a clearer picture. If their actions had drawn the notice of an agency, then this wasn't just misuse. It was an established pattern, one carried out with a confidence that relied entirely on my silence. I sat with that for a moment, not to process it, but to recognize how deeply it validated everything I had begun to suspect. This wasn't an overreaction. This wasn't impulsive. This was overdue. As I organized the confirmation emails into separate folders, another notification appeared, this time from a credit monitoring service. It noted a recent change that wasn't initiated by me, a small but telling attempt to access something recently locked. The failed attempt registered as a simple alert, yet it revealed more than the message stated. Someone had tried to re-enter a door I had finally closed. I didn't need to guess who. Motivation tends to reveal identity long before evidence does, but guessing wasn't necessary. The alert served one purpose: to affirm that the steps I had taken were not only justified, but essential. I sat back and let the quiet extend through the RV. The documents were organized, the reports were filed, the systems were in motion. None of these actions required confrontation. They required accuracy and follow-through. Two things I had always been capable of, even when I spent years offering more room than I should have. The morning had shifted into early afternoon by the time I finished. The sunlight caught the edge of the folder again, but it no longer held any weight. It wasn't a symbol of what they had done. It was a reminder of what I refused to carry anymore. Everything that needed to be set in motion had been set. The consequences would reach wherever they needed to. And every outcome would reflect a simple truth. Access granted without permission was no longer part of my life. The shift didn't happen all at once. It unfolded gradually, like a quiet ripple moving through still water, subtle at first but unmistakable once it reached the shore. My phone began to light up in uneven intervals, each notification marking a point of impact I didn't bother softening. The people who had grown accustomed to access were suddenly confronted with its absence, and the silence they had relied on no longer worked in their favor. The first wave of messages appeared mid-afternoon, short alerts from shared platforms requesting reauthorization. They meant nothing to me, but to whoever attempted to re-enter my accounts, they must have carried the weight of something slipping out of their control. The alerts multiplied quickly: failed logins, rejected attempts, connection errors. They revealed a pattern of dependency much deeper than I expected, a level of familiarity with my accounts that had gone unnoticed because I never questioned it. None of the notifications required my response. They were simply evidence that the boundaries I set were not theoretical. They were actively closing doors that had been left open too long. A different kind of alert followed soon after, this one from a system that monitored unusual activity. A lockout occurred after repeated attempts to access a financial profile. The attempts had been made within minutes of one another, as though urgency had replaced caution. That urgency didn't concern me. It confirmed something I already understood. The dependency wasn't temporary. It had become habitual, and habit resists disruption with a particular desperation. The RV remained calm around me as the alerts continued, the air still and steady in contrast to whatever confusion gathered outside. I could imagine the reactions without needing to witness them. Confusion would turn into speculation, speculation into unease into the realization that the structure they'd relied on was no longer intact. What I couldn't imagine, what no one could, was the moment they realized the consequences weren't limited to inconvenience. Late in the afternoon, another kind of notification appeared, one triggered by the reports I had filed earlier. Several agencies had updated the status of my submissions, noting that the documentation had moved from review to verification. Their language was measured and procedural, but the subtext was unmistakable. The information I provided aligned with discrepancies already flagged in their systems. Every confirmation reinforced the same truth. Their actions had extended farther than I ever knew. A new alert arrived shortly after, this one from an auditing department. It acknowledged inconsistencies tied to filings that involved my identity. The message listed possible next steps, each one dependent on further internal evaluation. Nothing in the alert was emotional. It was structural, the kind of mechanism that activates only when enough red flags accumulate. I didn't feel vindicated reading it. I felt certain. The system wasn't reacting to my complaint. It was responding to a trail that had existed long before I uncovered it. As the sun shifted lower, the campground noise changed tone. Voices rose from the area where the group usually gathered, sharper than usual, layered with tension rather than conversation. I didn't need to stand outside to understand the reason. The failed logins, the restricted access, the system warnings. Each one chipped away at the belief that everything would continue unchallenged. That belief had been their greatest resource. Its loss created tremors louder than any confrontation. I remained inside the RV, letting the afternoon settle around me. The folder still sat on the table, though it held no new meaning. Everything in motion had moved beyond what the papers could show. I wasn't waiting for an apology or explanation. I wasn't waiting for a realization or reckoning. The systems already set in place would handle whatever came next, independent of my presence or emotion. Another alert appeared, this one more specific. It documented an attempt to modify a detail associated with my identity, flagged immediately due to the freeze. The automated message noted that the attempt had been denied and logged. The record attached to the alert included the approximate location of the request. It came from within the campground. Even that didn't surprise me. People often believe urgency can override accountability, as though rushing can undo boundaries created with intent. What they didn't anticipate was how thoroughly those boundaries had been reinforced. As evening settled over the campground, I noticed the change not through sound, but through stillness. Movement outside had slowed, voices had quieted, and the energy softened into something heavy, taut, and uncertain. Whatever realizations were forming out there belonged entirely to them. I didn't need to participate in their unraveling. The notifications eventually faded into silence, not because the situation resolved, but because attempts had stopped. The structure they relied on was no longer accessible, and every avenue they tried had been sealed before they reached it. The calm that followed wasn't victory, it was separation. The first real distance between who I had been for them and who I was finally allowing myself to be. There was a stillness the next morning that didn't resemble calm. It carried a kind of weight that settles only when consequences begin to take shape in places no one expected. I stepped outside briefly, not to search for reactions, but to feel the distance that had formed between their world and mine. The campground felt unchanged, yet something beneath its surface had shifted irrevocably. I didn't linger. The day ahead didn't require observation. It required acknowledgement of what had already been set into motion. Back inside the RV, another series of notifications waited. These weren't the frantic alerts from shared access or failed logins. They came from institutions. Formal, measured, unmistakably direct. A financial agency confirmed that my report had advanced to a review involving unauthorized use of identifying information. The language was restrained, but the implications were precise. Their actions had crossed thresholds far beyond personal boundaries. A separate update arrived from the dealership's compliance team. The recovery process had moved forward, and the vehicle was no longer in their possession. Their message outlined the next steps they were obligated to follow: documentation transfer, insurance cancellation, account adjustment. The structure was clinical, yet nothing in it resembled the certainty they once held over my life. Then came another alert, this one from a federal tax office. A filing associated with my name had been flagged due to inconsistencies triggered by the documentation I submitted. The notification did not accuse me, it simply stated the reality of a developing inquiry. Their involvement meant something larger had surfaced, something built long before I recognized the pattern. Whatever they had done with my information had extended into systems far more consequential than shared subscriptions or casual financial shortcuts. I let the weight of that clarity settle, not because it startled me, but because it confirmed the depth of what I had sensed. What they treated as convenience had grown into something structural, and structures collapse under scrutiny. As the morning unfolded, the ripples traveled further. Another notice arrived, this time from a credit bureau. It documented a sharp decline in the credit score attached to the individuals who had intertwined their accounts with mine. The reason was explicit: outstanding balances, delinquent payments, and discrepancies tied to the car loan, now classified as fraudulent. Their financial stability had begun to unravel, not through retaliation, but through exposure. Later in the afternoon, a new update appeared from a local agency overseeing business licenses. The records tied to ventures connected indirectly to my information were now under review. The agency requested additional verification, noting that unresolved identity misuse could jeopardize active licenses. Their message reflected procedure, not emotion. Procedure, however, carries consequences no one can negotiate with. The campground atmosphere changed again as the day progressed. Movement outside became uneven. Sharp footsteps, abrupt pauses, hurried conversations carried by the wind. None of it reached me directly, yet the tension in the air made their unraveling feel tangible. I didn't approach the group. I didn't need to. Their world was adjusting to the absence of the person who had held it together more than they ever admitted. Inside the RV, the silence wasn't empty. It was definitive. They had spent years assuming my stability was a resource they could draw from endlessly. When that resource disappeared, the structure they built on top of it fractured in ways they hadn't anticipated. By early evening, the final update of the day arrived. It came from a legal office acknowledging receipt of the documents tied to the misuse investigation. They informed me that any parties involved in unauthorized actions might be contacted for statements. The wording was measured, but the implication was clear. The situation no longer belonged to me alone. It had entered a realm where accountability was not optional. The sun dipped low outside as I sat with the quiet realization that the distance between us was no longer emotional. It was structural, legal, permanent. Their attempts to control the narrative, the access, the identity they borrowed had dissolved under the weight of their own decisions. I didn't feel triumphant. What I felt was resolution. A line had been crossed long before I recognized it, and correcting its course was not cruelty. It was necessary. As the evening settled into darkness, a single thought surfaced with absolute clarity. The moment you stop carrying what was never yours to hold, the people who depended on your silence are forced to face their own reflection. And sometimes, losing access to you is the greatest consequence they will ever experience.